So we are going to go through some topics. We don't have to go into too much depth, but it's something that we wanted to make people who make it this far at least aware of, some of the things that we're thinking about, some of our concerns, and potentially some of the things you may run into as you're adopting the architecture in your organization. So the first of those is, how do you deal with CDM and vocabulary updates? I could share my experience from within Janssen, where we sometimes do a full rebuild, depending on the update we get from a vendor. Sometimes we do an incremental build, where we just do the most recent year worth of patient data. We do not update our vocabulary every time the vocabulary working group publishes a vocab update. It just doesn't make sense for us to do it with that frequency. We do quarterly updates of most of our databases. Some of them are semi-annual. We have one that's an annual update only. So when a vocab update happens, we try to evaluate that vocab update. And then when we're doing kind of our next full batch of almost all of our CDMs, then we will go ahead and pull that new vocabulary down and make that part of our process. Same thing with the schema conversions and updates. When do you go from 5.0 to 5.1 to 5.2 to 6? I really don't think it's a huge deal right now if you're not on 5.1 or 5.2. But if you're not on 5, then it's a big deal. So largely, I think that those decisions in your organizations should be driven based on need. So like in 5.2, they have a bunch of modifications for the way costs are being handled. It may be the case that you're doing a lot of health economics research and you need that cost information in the newer, better formats. And if so, then you want to adopt that sooner rather than later. But if that's something that you're not focused on, then you could skip 5.2 and you should be okay still. Yeah, and there is a script out there that will take you from 4 to 5 if you are still on 4. Not necessarily perfect, but it will get you very close. So there are ways to get there. R package management, cohort method, database connector, SQL render, feature extraction, and so on are R packages that you could likely be using in a bunch of your work. If you aren't now, I do suggest taking a look at how they could be leveraged. They do update frequently. One of the things that I recommend as a best practice is always calling session info at the end of any R program. That dumps to the screen all of the versions of all the packages that you're using. You could also use the DevTools library to do installation of packages directly from GitHub, which is the preferred approach to doing it. You could also use Drat, which is something else that's maintained using or through Mark and Martine. They have that set up to integrate with CRAN. There's lots of ways to manage them. The one thing I'll say to be careful about is whenever you're doing a study in your environment, we as an architecture right now don't do a great job of leaving breadcrumbs of everything that you did on what you did. So which version of the R packages were you running at what time? What version of R were you running at the time of the study? What version of the data source that you had loaded were you running? What version of a vocabulary were you using at the time? All of those things matter. So we don't do a great job of leaving those breadcrumbs. So my recommendation again is take note of it yourself when you're doing your studies. Dump your session info from your R session in those cases. Take notes off the configuration screen in Atlas. Keep as much of a log as you can of things. One of the nice things in Arachne is that all of the versions and information does get dumped into a log for when you're doing some of their study setups already, so that is a help. The last piece here is security. There's been a couple questions about what levels of security or how is security implemented within the architecture. Today we have Shiro integrated with the Web API. So Shiro is a Apache project that implements security in a variety of ways. It has multiple authentication mechanisms and then an authorization process in it. For authentication, I believe the current release with Shiro in the Web API supports OAuth and Active Directory. Not well, NTLM. You know, so it has to be running on a Windows box to use Windows NT credentials. OAuth too. So there's a variety of security authentication mechanisms you could use to identify who you are. The Atlas UI is not end-to-end implemented to be all fully security aware. But there are modules in there, and as you run into issues, if you post them, there are groups who are addressing them. Colleagues in Europe are more actively using the secured version of Atlas in the Web API, so they have been pushing things ahead. In our environment at Jensen, we're not running it because it's limited to certain teams that have access to it, so we're not as concerned with the security of the installation. But it is something that's there, it's available, so if running in a secure mode is important to you, you can do that. And there's documentation that's up on the site that shows you how to turn it on, and then potentially if your intent is to add secure new features to Web API, there's documentation on how to integrate Shiro into any web service API calls that you're looking to implement. Greg, did you want to talk through the next two slides? Yeah? That'd be awesome.
Well, we can talk about it together, I guess. So the idea is, again, going back to the idea that, hey, we're at the point we need to conduct federated studies as a community, as a single open source, essentially, organization. And the environments that we have today, I mean, as an example, Atlas, everybody knows the link to Atlas at ohdsi.org is definitely not controlled. It's definitely quite difficult to create a reusable and reproducible analysis code in existing Atlas installation, because you never know who's going to change it tomorrow, right? There are people constantly playing with Atlas. It's being used more as a demo.
Yeah, it was intended as a demo.
Exactly. So it's never intended to be used to share or even designs or conduct observational studies. But we're at the point when it's becoming real, and I think what we, actually it's a proposal, what we're proposing to do as a group is we need to break off and separate and have two environments. One environment that we use for demo purposes, which is needed if people want to come and play and understand tools and even demonstrate those capabilities to someone. And the second environment where we actually run and conduct real observational research, meaning it's more controlled, it's more secure, it's properly managed to your point. It needs to be backed up, and it needs to be archived, and it needs to be proper SSL certificate installed, and it needs to support single sign-on, so that you don't have to remember 5 different logins across 5 different systems that are being used to conduct research. And there are, of course, the way I see there are 3 core components that we need to enable such research, and we have those committed as open source products. One of them is, I'm going to start with Atlas Web API. It's an older product. It's a very mature product. It's established. Community understands that. The second product is, again, Arachne, and the third product is Athena. So if you think about it from, again, functional perspective, is, you know, Atlas Web API is a great tool that can be used to design analysis/studies, whether it's a simple cohort or more complex examples of patient-level prediction, the latest, or population-level effect estimation. That's where you design that. And Arachne is a tool, again, was created to enable people to conduct an end-to-end study across multiple organizations. That's where you manage your study lifecycle. That's where you invite people and team, collaborate, share code, share results, analytical results, and so on, publish papers. And Athena, again, is often overlooked tool, but you know, it's fundamental for people to again, download vocabularies. Vocabularies is essentially a reference data set that used to design those cohorts, to design those studies. So those environments need to be managed properly, and what we're proposing is, again, start with a simple separation. Again, we have a production, we have a demo, and all of the tools in production or demo to the same extent needs to be linked through the same authentication and authorization mechanisms, so that people don't have to remember 5 different logins, 5 different tools.
So the current sandbox environment is really owned by a lot of people in the center. What is their take on this proposal of having a separate production environment?
I think they're going to love it. once they hear it.
So as you're saying, this is a proposed idea that we believe currently having the site the way it is, where it's pure demo mode without any kind of additional levels of security on stuff where we may actually want to collaborate on, say, a cohort definition without the risk of, me accidentally leaving myself on that web page and my, sixth grader like deleting the cohort, because nothing would stop somebody from doing that right now.
I guess there's nothing to stop us just taking the open source that you put out there and putting it onto the current environment with the lockdown mode. Leaving the current environment is backed up.
No, absolutely. And again, we need to, again, back to your point in the comments you make, you need to look at many different things: release cycle, scalability, how many people are going to use it, backup, archiving, single sign-on, things like that. So, if people in general agree with this idea, and I don't see why they wouldn't agree with this idea, right? We'll probably need to go back to Columbia and the leads in the RSC community and just put this proposal on the table and then discuss details and logistics of how we can.
The goal would be to have an existing environment the way it is, where it's wide open, demo, people could play around and do whatever, but to have another environment where it's a little bit locked down and where we're able to collaborate on things like cohort definitions and specifications on things.
I guess it all comes down to who's managing those two environments.
Lead management.
Well, I don't think we have a specific proposal, specific details. I think we're just opening this as an idea that for people maybe to provide some feedback, raise any issues. And I think there are many options on how we can approach standing up this infrastructure, managing this infrastructure. Things will definitely need to change a little bit.
One of the limitations that we've always been under is very, very limited budget for the current sandbox environment. So it's going to be a production environment, then there's different thinking that needs to happen again.
Yeah.
It's going to be managed and funded.
All good questions. Definitely we'll need to discuss it.
I love the tool. I think it's an amazing demo. And so much better than what we have.
Thanks, Lee. Yeah. And I think the next one, and again, this is a draft, an idea for people to provide feedback, but that's what it could look like. Again, we got rsc.org DNS names, so you don't have to guess for a production environment, and that's the roadmap.
That's the roadmap.
And then for a demo environment, the same similar kind of style DNS names that are consistent, so people don't have to guess, and it's easily findable and discoverable. But that's what it, again, could look like. Whether it's a finalized proposal that say this is it, probably not yet. But as a start, again, we just wanted to share this idea with everybody and get your feedback.
It's good input to the LC leadership.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Okay. Looking back and to the road ahead, hooray. So the OHDSI architecture is currently deployed successfully at large pharma companies, payers, and academic medical centers, but it isn't easy to do nor as widely adopted as we would like. I think that's a pretty true statement. And so the question becomes, how can we take a look at the ways in which we are leaving things in a state where they are too difficult to adopt and or that people aren't able to deploy it in their environments. And so we've talked about this today, so I won't spend a lot of time, but if you want to read through it, this is essentially my prepared statement on what it takes to start getting ready to actually deploy. And I'm leaving steps out. So it's not easy, it's not fun, and we hope to try and provide better ways to allow the deployment of the stack in an environment. Specifically what you saw today around using Docker as a deployment mechanism. So while, as I mentioned, we won't be pushing this as a only way to deploy, likely ever, but we would like to make this the recommended way to deploy until we are eating our own dog food and doing it. Personally, I could account for we will be doing it at Janssen before I start recommending it, and we will be doing it within the OHDSI infrastructure before we as a community start recommending it. Although hopefully from what you saw today in these demos, This would provide a simpler, more straightforward approach for deploying the solution without having to get into all the fine-grained details. And so hopefully this is where we're able to go soon. Another criticism is the availability and transparency of the specifications that we have. We were going to talk a little bit more detail about that. I don't know that we want to get into it today because it's getting late, but essentially the idea that we should be publishing our specifications for things before we're releasing software that implements some feature functionality. And so that is going to be our goal, and the hope is that before we go forward with new things, we will have the discipline to go back and document existing things. So the first being concept sets. We already have a draft specification for that. We could get your feedback. There's a draft specification. We're using OpenAPI 3.0 as a specification tool. If you're not familiar with that, it used to be Swagger or Swagger Hub in the 2.0. It is something that's been adopted by Google and IBM and others. So it seems like there's a good amount of people on the bandwagon. Is there anyone who is anti, and this isn't the only forum you'll have a chance to voice an opinion, but if you're like, no, OpenAPI 3, that's terrible, you know, or you have another idea, anything that anyone wants to throw at me or suggest? Okay, good. So then something like that. Again, we're not forcing that as the only solution right now. There are other options. I think you had mentioned GraphQL was another way to approach the web services.
Yes, other options to look at.
Yeah, so you favor this one, so even, okay, great. So we will go ahead and publish specifications, and then, like I said, we're going to do it for things that exist before we start approaching newer things.
I just wanted to say, so besides just making those public, it also, like with the concept set stuff, I'm building some stuff that does concept sets, and I want to change the specification. So I can't just go in and change it for Atlas and everything like that. But when the specification is up on GitHub, then I can fork it or do whatever so that I'm in the conversation.
Absolutely.
And my change is something that people can see and they can consider.
Yes.
And do a diff on it.
Absolutely, yeah. So I understand your point because there have been at least two groups that I'm aware of that have done work on concept sets where they've had tools working with them and they've had to kind of back into what the actual spec is underneath it. So absolutely, I am always going to be in favor of the idea of looking at any of our specifications and modifying them, improving them, changing them. That's what they're there for, is to be a history and a record of exactly how it is we're going to agree to communicate with each other. But before we start changing them, we need to publish them. So yeah, we'll get the publication out of what the specifications are as is, and then we could start taking proposals on what the 2Bs would look like. In one conversation I was having, we were talking about we could just have a repo called like service specifications or API specifications or whatever, and we'll manage all of our specifications in that repo. So then we'll have same thing, pull requests, everything through GitHub. So we'll have source control of our specs, and we'll go from there.
Now I'm just wondering, would it be ridiculous to combine that with the new place that they're doing the CDM repo? Like just have it off in its own directory of that? Or do you think it just doesn't belong there?
Yeah, it's different. Yeah, I wouldn't decide now, but yeah, so like there is a CDM repo, but that's kind of like the DDL and things like that for the database. I would probably suggest we have a separate one. You know, like one of the things that I could imagine us doing is having this repo be a dependency for something like Web API, so that we could do validation based on JSON specification of messages that come in. Right, so I would think we might want to make it as standalone a repo as possible, so you're not like having dependency on like the whole CDM spec coming into your project just for those JSON docs, you know. But that would be the basic idea is as something that we could improve. And so yeah, our specifications, the two solutions. One is this open API initiative. So the thought is we'll try to move in that direction. The other direction, this little funky little leaf guy. Who knows the funky leaf guy? Anyone? Anyone? Bueller? So that's the MongoDB logo. And so one of the other challenges we have today is when we try to evolve a new feature into the platform, we have to do a bunch of stuff, and it starts to sound like that example I was giving of how hard it is to deploy the web API, but you have to have some kind of a new object model. You have to develop a web front end to allow you to edit it. That web front end almost inevitably is binding to a JSON document. That JSON document then has to be sent back to the web API through some set of CRUD, create, read, update, delete services that you have to then write. And then you take that document inside that web API CRUD set of services, and you go through JPA, which is the Java Persistence Architecture layer, to then do an object relational mapping of your complex JSON object to a set of relational tables, and then you kind of want to kill yourself. And so rather than all that, a thought, and somewhere we are thinking about moving, is integrating MongoDB in the same way we integrated Solr in our quick demo. It's probably not going to be as fast or happen during a tutorial, but the idea would be integrate Mongo as the Docker instance, make that our specification repository. For those who don't know, MongoDB is a document repository. So we would allow someone to just save the specification document out, and all those individual steps that I had just gone through that sounded painful and are painful would be removed. Now, are we going to do that? No. Why? First, we're going to draft a specification for a specification repository. I apologize for specification, but the idea is we should draft what we want that to look like, what the services are going to be, what the object models are that we're going to support. By the way, those are going to be things like concept sets and cohort definitions, which we just said we're going to develop and publish our specifications for those. So we need to publish a document that says, here's what the specification repository is going to look like. I've already had conversations like with folks with Cloudera. They may not want to put it in Mongo. They may create a service that uses their existing service layers for things and storing it in Hadoop. Great, that's the idea. We need to be more transparent and provide specifications for things. We will provide a reference implementation of it, but we won't make the assumption that everyone wants to use Mongo or that's going to be the only approach to doing it.
Frank, sorry if this is stupid, but if I don't understand, probably other people don't. Why isn't it just enough to define it in OpenAPI and you know, you have some text of your JSON schema? Why do you have to save it in Mongo or something?
We're not saving the specification in Mongo, we're saving the instances of your documents. So there's a concept set. Today, concept sets in the OHDSI schema are stored through a combination of two relational tables. Cohort definitions is like 3. If you look anything at what the population level effect estimation schema looks like, that's a bear. And doing it in a one-to-many environment is something Anthony Senna had to work on, and he's not happy with having to do that through JPA and everything else. So it's those documents that we store in MongoDB, as opposed to having to always do an object relational map for our JSON documents. Sorry. Make sense? Okay. Anthony never complains about anything. So for him to complain about what that took, it means something. Yeah. Okay, so those are just ideas again. This won't be the only forum that were discussed before we move forward on them, but at least people are aware, and hopefully these start to address some of the challenges we've outlined that we already have. Gauging interest, you know, because everybody's interested in this stuff at 4:15 on a Friday after a 3-day symposium. Kong. Anybody heard of Kong? Raise your hands. You? Nobody else? Okay. Microservice architecture, the idea that instead of having one API specification out there in implementation, we'd actually have a layer that manages our APIs. Something to think about. If it's not something that everyone's currently going like, yeah, let's talk about, then we could go on to our second one. Jupyter. Is anybody using Jupyter? I keep getting asked about it. People bring it up on calls. People threw it into the John Duke instant feedback thing that we need Jupyter. Anybody here using Jupyter in their organizations? No? Just itching? Okay, good. Yes? All right, so there's one. Okay, cool. I'm just curious about that to think, do I need to be thinking more about it? I think it potentially adds value, but until we start seeing actual use cases, I don't think we need to jump through hoops. Wrapping up. If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. Sir Isaac Newton. So I mentioned earlier today how so many of the pieces of the OHDSI architecture are not mine. It's an open source community, so it really is a community-based architecture. I've just had a really good seat for watching it all evolve over time. So many of the pieces have grown based off of the efforts of other people, and by the nature of the way we've been able to leverage them, we're all benefiting from that compilation of effort over the past 7 years since OMOP started, whether it be the CDM or the Achilles data quality through to Atlas to vocabulary, and now as early as this symposium, patient level prediction. So hopefully we can continue to see further together by leveraging what we all have, deploying things and sharing things within the community. And that's my hope and goal for this group. And so I will thank everybody for sticking it out this late and being here with us throughout the tutorial today. And thank you again for coming.